Hi, this is Beth Wadham from the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education, and welcome to the December webinar, Architecti et usus meditatio, Vitruvian Echoes in Contemplative Practice. We're here with Peter Schneider, Professor of Architecture and Chancellor Scholar at the College of Architecture and Planning from the University of Colorado at Denver. A little bit of background about Peter Schneider, who has his degree from the University of Cape Town, South Africa, where he was born and raised. He's been in the U.S. since 1977, teaching architecture and directing architecture programs at Alabama, Louisiana, and now at the University of Colorado, but you may still hear a South African inflection to his voice. An ongoing focus of Peter's scholarly research has been the history of the architect, in particular how the architect's mind, motive, manner, and methods have affected the natural and cultural landscape and the discipline's traditions. We're really delighted to offer this webinar with Professor Schneider, he's been a pioneer in contemplative education. In 1997, he received a Contemplative Practice Fellowship for developing the course Found Spaces, Mindful Practice in Architectural Design. And in the years since, he's continued to explore the influence of Contemplatio and meditatio on the shapes and forms of contemporary architectural practice. He taught at our summer contemplative curriculum development session this past August and has participated in meetings and symposia on contemplative practice in the arts. Welcome, Peter, and thank you for sharing this with us today. And now I'll hand over the presentation to you.
Thank you, Beth. Again, I'm very, very pleased to be here, and I'll talk this afternoon for about 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes, and we'll then open up to questions. I'd like to begin by introducing you to Marcus Vitruvius Polio, a Roman architect who was born in about 80 BC, died in about 15 BC, and although he has this tripartite name, is most commonly known by the name Vitruvius. He is famous not because he was a great architect, but because between 30 and 25 BCE, he wrote 10 books on architecture, which are called De Architectura. They were books they're a commentarius or a commentary that summarized the sort of knowledge from classical Greeks about architecture and put those into a framework for contemporary practice. And so his fame is in having written this particular book, which is the oldest surviving text on architecture. This afternoon I'm going to talk about three terms that he uses: meditatio, cogitatio, and contemplatio. And I'm going to suggest that the Western tradition of contemplative practice finds its roots in what was architectural practice beginning in about 2400 BC and winding its way down through history. The term meditatio, which Vitruvius uses in the first sentence of the first section of his first book, comes from the Greek medesthai, the Greek term medesthai, and means to be mindful. I introduce that now because it has a second meaning. Medesthai also carries the meaning of finding the measure of things. So, with these two meanings, and I'll talk about each of these, but I'll come back to the finding the measure of things a bit later in the discussion. Again, the first sentence, first book, first chapter, first sentence, this is the Latin. And I point your attention, or I draw your attention, if I can, to these words here in the second paragraph. Fabrica est continuata actrita usus meditatio. Oh, sorry about that. Architecture is the child of two kinds of knowledge, knowing how and knowing that. And Vitruvius writes this: knowing how is a continuous and careful meditation on the work as it is being done, and of an attention to the way that its form is changed by the intention. Knowing that is the explanation of the way that the thing has been made and the order and measure behind its arrangement. And So the use of the term meditatio as a form of working for architects appears in the literature very, very early on. What Vitruvius means by this meditatio is this, that one works by paying attention to what you're doing while you're doing what you're paying attention to. That term is a slight kind of modification of a term that was developed by Donald Schoen, the MIT sociologist in the 1970s, when he did a study of the way that professionals work. And he calls this reflection in action, so that not using the term meditatio, meditation in the Vitruvian sense, he uses reflection in action. To give you an example of how that works, Le Corbusier was a French architect. The building you see there is an iconic house in the history of modern architecture. It's called the Villa Savoy. And Corbusier writes this: architecture is a pure conception of the mind. It must be conceived in the head, sitting in a chair with the eyes shut. And he iterates that and begins to, through that, talk about how in contemporary architectural practice the Vitruvian use of meditation appears in different ways. The term fabrica, which Vitruvius uses, is a term that means making or working. And so through that first sentence, he's calling fabrica, through usus meditatio, a meditative practice or a mindful practice, a mindful way of working. In the first sentence of the second section of the first book, he writes this, and again, I'm merely point out in Latin the terms cogitatio and inventione. The translation is this: designio, drawing, dispositor is drawing or design, is the result of two things, contemplation and invention. Contemplation is careful, serious thought. It is a mindful attention directed toward the pleasure that comes in making the work. Invention is the effect of this effort and throws new light on unfamiliar things. So again, we find Vitruvius here talking about drawing rather than just the act of working, as paying attention to what you're doing as you're doing what you're paying attention to. And again, reflection in action in Donald Schoen's work began to be translated as reflective practice, and the whole reflective practice movement comes out of Schoen's work in the 70s, which borrows from Dewey's work in the 50s, and ultimately goes, it seems, all the way back to Vitruvius at the crux of the millennium. So drawing is what architects do. It's the way architects think. This is a sequence of drawings, a transformation from a very rudimentary sketch to a finished drawing through a number of stages. This happens again and again and again in the practice of this particular architect, Douglas Darden. These are study drawings, which in the end turn into the final drawings which you see on the bottom row there, which are rather magnificent things. But Rainer Banham is an architectural critic and theorist, makes the point that drawing has such crucial value for architects that being unable to think without drawing becomes the mark of one truly socialized into the craft of architecture and its profession. And just so you don't think the scribble that you see on your screens there is just a scribble. It's a drawing by Frank Gehry. He does many sketches, and we'll meet him in just a moment. This is a sketch in one of the hundreds and hundreds of sketches he did for the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. And you can see how the kind of form of the building is actually emerging in this particular sketch when I overlay it over a photograph of the finished building. So disegno, or drawing, in Vitruvian terms is industriae vigilantiasque. Drawing is a mindful practice. I want to just comment a little bit on drawing and the experience of drawing in using the words of two architects. Frank Gehry again writes, architecture must solve complex problems. We must understand and use technology. We must create buildings that are safe and dry, that respect their context and their neighbors, that face the myriad issues of social responsibility and even please the client. But then, what he says, as soon as I understand the scale of the building in the relation to the site and the relationship to the client, as soon as the facts of the building become more and more clear to me, I start doing sketches, hundreds and hundreds of sketches. I draw and draw until the building finally shows itself to me. The point I make here is that Gehry does the drawings almost as an act of waiting for the epiphany of the building revealing itself through the drawings, through the act that the building reveals itself. And again, for him, and he writes about this, drawing is very much this process of reflection in action. This is a drawing by Alvar Aalto, the Finnish modern architect, and he writes more or less exactly the same thing as Gehry. And I won't read this, I'll just summarize it. There's a hugely complex set of forces working on the drawing, and that number demands and often creates a barrier that makes it difficult for the architectural idea to break through. And then he writes this: in such cases, I often work by instinct, for the moment forgetting the maze of problems. I begin to draw in a manner rather like that of abstract art. Led only by my instincts, I draw. Sometimes I draw what seem to be childish compositions. By drawing, I eventually come upon an abstraction that leads me directly to the architectural idea. The sketch reveals a matrix with whose help the numerous quarreling conditions can be brought into harmony. And again, for Aalto, drawing is a reflective practice. I'm going to sort of use the stone to try and get to a definition of what I think is a really good definition of reflective practice or reflection in action. Sorry, wrong. Annie Dillard wrote a collection of essays in a book called Teaching the Stone to Talk. The focal essay in that collection is an essay called Teaching the Stone to Talk, and it's about a neighbor of hers up in the coast in the Pacific Northwest, live in a small community right on the cliffs above a beach with beach stones. And Larry has found one of these stones and spends his time teaching the stone, or trying to teach the stone to talk. He's very serious about it. He keeps it wrapped in a wonderfully smooth deerskin suede pouch, takes it out 3 times a day, and teaches it to talk. Nobody knows quite what he does, but this is what Annie Dillard writes about that. I assume that like any other meaningful effort, Larry's ritual involves the practice of self-sacrifice, the suppression of self-consciousness, and the development of a certain precise tilt of the will, so that the will becomes transparent and hollow, a channel for the work. That's perhaps the best characterization, it's not a definition, but characterization of sort of meditative work or mindful attention to one's work that I've ever come across. It's practice of self-sacrifice, the suppression of self-consciousness, and the development of a certain precise tilt of the will. And the important thing, I think, here in this kind of reflection of hers is that the will becomes transparent and hollow, a channel for the work. Louis Kahn is a very famous American architect, died in 1974, was perhaps the best or the greatest American architect and certainly the greatest teacher in the second half of the 20th century. And he writes this about his Kimball Museum. This building feels, and it's a good feeling, as if I had nothing to do with it, as if some hands other than my own shaped it. The will becomes transparent and hollow, a channel for the work. And Kahn, again and again and again, sort of reflects on the fact that at a certain point one becomes so engaged with the work that the work begins to shape itself. And it's that kind of, that work shape, that interaction between the architect and the work that is at the basis of this use of meditation, or usus meditatio, which Vitruvius talks about. So for Breker, there's handwork, making with the hands, and Vitruvius links meditatio to that. Drawing or disegno is drawing, and Vitruvius links this other word, cogitation or cogitatione, which I've translated as contemplation or reflection, to that. but both are kind of equal things. They both are mindful practices and use mindful attention to the work and in fact meld one another and join, so that fabrica, disegno, making and drawing become meditative, contemplative acts that involve reflection in action. The last little point I want to make on those two words is that cogitationo, contemplation or reflection, as Vitruvius characterizes it, is mindful attention. But it's a very special kind of mindful attention because it's directed towards the pleasure that comes in making the work, and in a sense it's also directed toward the pleasure that comes in doing the work. The work itself gives you that pleasure and invites you into that engagement with itself. Richard Sennett last year published a book called The Craftsman. It was a groundbreaking book, and in it he's fascinated by the crafts and by the fact that they are handwork or that they involve handiwork of different kinds. And makes the point in the book that handwork is reflection in action and that handiwork is a reflective practice, that the crafts are all about reflective practice or about attentive kind of doing is the word he would use. The central, what does he call it, the guiding intuition of the book, according to Sennett, is the fact that making is thinking. When the potter is shaping that pot you see there, it is a way of thinking about how to make a pot and what a pot needs to look like and what the pot might need to do and what its qualities and characteristics are. Making is thinking, and because making is thinking, it leads eventually to what Sennett calls mastery. The whole goal in the craft tradition is to master the craft, to become a master of its secrets and mysteries. Sennett in his book talks about how one teaches mastery, or how one exposes a student or an apprentice to things that would give one mastery. And he says this mastery is achieved through using expressive modes of instruction. By using sympathetic illustration, which identifies with the difficulties the neophyte encounters. By using scene narrative, which places the learner in a strange situation. And by using metaphorical instruction, which encourages the learner to imaginatively reframe what he or she is doing. These are the characteristics he after lots of research he finds underlie all apprenticeships. Drawing is also thinking, and drawing also leads to mastery. And Roland Barthes, in an essay of his which discusses the difference between the photograph and the drawing, makes these comments. Mastery in drawing is achieved through using subtle modes of instruction. Drawing must be learned through apprenticeship, through the passing on of its practices. Drawing's practices depend on a set of rule-governed transpositions and substitutions that are canonical. And lastly, the drawing cannot and does not represent everything. It necessarily leaves things out. What you do when you look at the drawing and look at the procedures that Barthes isolates, they tend to map directly onto Sennett's sympathetic illustration, scene narrative, and metaphorical instruction, so that there's a direct parallel between what Sennett says about making and what Barthes says about kind of drawing. And I will be coming back to this in just a little while. I want to digress just a little bit as we're talking about mindfulness, meditatio. I'd like to talk a little bit about being mindless. And I want to use the work of Ellen Langer to introduce that. Ellen Langer of psychology at Harvard has spent a lot of time doing research, particularly into mindlessness, and with the goal of defining what mindfulness might be. And she characterizes mindless action using three kind of poles. First, there's an entrapment in old categories. Next, there's automatic behavior that precludes attending to new signals. And finally, there's action that operates from a single perspective. Let me give you a very, very quick story or illustration. She loved to play tricks on the architecture faculty at Harvard. And so she would dress her students up in tuxes with wedding gowns and rent a huge limo. And they would arrive at the house of one of the architecture faculty, knock on the door and say, well, we're doing the scavenger hunt and we stand to win a huge prize of $100,000 for this charity, and we're down to our last thing. We were told you might be able to help us, and we're looking for a piece of wood 7 foot by 3 foot. It's so important, we're prepared to pay you $10,000 if you have that piece of wood and give it to us. After thinking a while, the faculty would say, sorry, I don't have that. And couldn't think of, Home Depot is closed, building construction sites are closed, nothing they could do, so they had to say sorry. Next morning, a faculty member might go by Home Depot and walk through the department that has doors, and all of a sudden realize that a door is a slab of wood 3 feet by 7 feet, approximately. And that last night, he could have taken the door off its hinges at his house and sold it for $10,000. He's entrapped in an old category in the sense that a door is a door. There's an automatic behavior in terms of, well, I can't do that because Home Depot's closed, the building's closed. And then there's this operating, pardon me, from a single perspective that sort of says, at night, at 11 o'clock at night, things are all shut down. I just cannot cope with that. Mindful behavior, as Langer characterizes it, therefore, is the opposite of mindfulness behavior. It relies on the continuous creation of new categories, an openness to new information, and an implicit awareness of more than one perspective. And again, if I take those 3 conditions of Langer's and map them back onto the Barth and Sennett kind of instructions, you see that her kind of view of mindfulness is tying back into these kind of ways of instructing designers and architects in mindful kind of practice, and is consistent with those. Again, I'll go back to Annie Dillard very quickly. I'm not going to reread this, but if you take Annie Dillard's 3 kind of descriptors of reflection in action or reflective practice or mindfulness, they again map almost directly, or they map directly onto Langer's 3 categories. And so we have this kind of sort of tying together of medesthai, meditatio, this being mindful that Vitruvius talks about and describes as a practice in his book, into modern kind of conceptions of meditation and contemplation and reflection, and ultimately contemplation. And I want to talk about Contemplatio right now, and sort of wrap this whole thing up in this whole subject of meditation up. The word medesthai, as I mentioned, was to find, another meaning was to find the measure of things. And Contemplatio, as it evolved as a term and a usage and a practice, was directly tied back to this meaning of medesthai, of finding the measure of things. And so, Contemplatio is about finding the measure of things. The reason you see that red ball of yarn there is because I'm having to illustrate something that I would much rather do in practice and in person. Barbara Gilly, who's a colleague, who was one of my kind of, in my group of fellows, Contemplative Practice fellows, she teaches at Naropa, teaches dance and movement, does a thing called the red square. And it's an act of contemplatio, of contemplation in the real sense. You'll see in your screens a very dim kind of red square there. I thought I needed to put that in just because the black made it look like everything went wrong. But what Barbara would do is she has this wonderful ball of yarn that's beautifully put together, and she begins to unravel it. And she puts one end at the bottom left-hand corner of this kind of dull square and very carefully unravels it and places it, the other end, on the floor. She then sort of goes up vertically, goes across, and then brings the cord down and closes this off. She'll then move to the corners and adjust it so that the square becomes really well formed, and all of a sudden in the space, the dance studio, the meditation hall, I've seen you do this in many places, you have something else. Something else has happened, something else has been discovered or found, this red square. Barbara then would ask either herself or she'll ask somebody who's participating in the practice to move inside the red square. And all of a sudden its character changes from this kind of sort of inanimate or abstract blank thing to something that is empowered or in which something else is embodied. She'll then ask the person in the square to talk about how they feel. And the person will generally say, well, I'm here and you're there. I'm inside, you're outside. I'm in this place, you're in that place. This is my place. That's your place. My place is special and your place is just ordinary. And ultimately they might come to two terms that Mircea Eliade uses. This is sacred. This is set apart. It's hallowed ground. And outside of it, you all are sitting in profane territory. So that making this red square creates here, creates inside this place, the special environment, and the sacred kind of space. And it's all about finding the measure of the thing. The stretching of the chord is all about finding the proper measure of the sides of the square. The term contemplate comes from the Latin Contemplatio, which comes from the root contemplum. Con and templum. Con means with. Templum comes from the Greek temnion, from the Proto-Indo-European term tem, which means to cut or to scratch or to mark by cutting or scratching or engraving or impressing. And it doesn't at all tie it. Templum is not about temple. It's not the word that's used for temple. So contemplum, to contemplate, Plato, do contemplatio, is to do something with a cut, with a scratch, and with a mark. And it's a very, very old tradition that parallels exactly what I described Barbara Dilly as doing, making this square, describing the edges that creates this inside that becomes a hallowed space, that has here, this place special, sacred, and particularly sacred and profane. Profanum is the Latin term that is the root of profane. Fanum is the Latin term for the temple. So being profanum is to be outside of the temple, to be outside of the sacred space of the temple. That notion of cutting and marking stuff in architecture goes back, I can trace it back in written form, documentary evidence, to about 2400 BCE in the annals of the Palermo stone, where there's a ceremony that marks the founding of a temple, which is called this stretching of the cord. And the stretching of the cord is always performed by the pharaoh and the prophet of Seshat, who is the goddess of the architects, and the goddess of kind of martial justice. This is a description of the founding of the temple of Edfu. I hold the peg. I grasp the handle of the club and grip the measuring cord with Seshat. I turn my eyes to the movements of the stars. I send forth my gaze to the bull's thigh, which is the great constellation of the Great Bear. I count off time. I watch the clock. I stretch the cord. I establish the four corners of your temple. This is a description of the same ceremony for the founding of the temple of Hathor in Dendera. Looking at the sky, at the course of the rising stars, recognizing the notch of the constellation of the bull's eye, the pharaoh and the goddess Seshat stretched the cord in joy, and laying it in the ground, marked the four corners of the temple of Her Majesty Hathor, the mistress of Dendera. And lastly, just to sort of nail this point down, this is the pharaoh Kepakare, Sesostris I, and his description of the founding of his pyramid, the marking out of his pyramid. The king appeared in his plumed crown with all the people following him. The chief lector, priest, and scribe of the god books stretched the cord. The cord was released, laid in the ground, made to be his monument. The king ordered the work to begin, and joined together were Upper and Lower Egypt. So that Contemplatio, as this act of cutting or scratching, marking or stretching the cord and laying it in the ground, is an act that establishes the place where the divine appears and reveals itself. That's what it was used for. It was ultimately always a very, very special act, an enormously mindful act, because it marked the place where the gods might, through an augury, speak to the Roman people, or through an oracle, speak to the Greek people, or through the prophets, speak to the Egyptian people. That space that's formed by that kind of spread marking out of the chord in Greek is called the chorus. It's where our term chorus, as the place where the orchestra now sits, comes from. But a chorus is the place in which things reveal themselves. And so, what the making of the red square, the making of Contemplatio is the act that created the chorus. Peter Brook, who's a director, an English director of theatre, made this comment: I can take any empty space and call it a bare stage. A figure walks into this empty place. Someone else is watching. That's all that is needed for an act of theatre to be revealed. Again, the creation of the empty space is necessary for the act of theatre to be revealed. Isaac Luria of Safed writes that in the 14th century, when it arose within the infinite to weave something out of its nothingness, it withdrew, contracting and concealing itself from its place, forming a void, an empty space, symptom, and it's in this empty space that all of Kante's things emerge. Martin Heidegger writes that space is something that has been made room for, something that is cleared and free within a boundary. A boundary is not that at which something stops, but it is that from which something begins. Space is that for which room has been made, that which is let into its boundary. So, the making of the red square is the fundamental architectural act. The sort of marking of the space, the marking of the room, is where architecture kind of begins, and it's an act that is necessarily contemplative, meditative, and mindful. And it's that because it has enormous consequences. Aristotle writes that everything is somewhere and in place. If this is its nature, the power of place must be a wonderful thing and be prior to all other things. That without which nothing else can exist, while it can itself exist without any other thing, must be first. Place does not pass out of existence when the things in it are removed. So the making of that space places, in a sense, the world, because things that exist need to be somewhere. And what is somewhere is in itself something. If it's nowhere, it is no thing, Aristotle would say. And like it has place as the first of all things. Everything that exists is in a place and cannot exist without a place. And lastly, Edward Casey, the philosopher from Yale, writes that place is always prior to the possibility of thought and reflection. All thought and all reflection must be placed in order to be. And again, that's the significance of that act of the red square. These are two, going back to Vitruvius, his myth of the origin of architecture takes place in a forest where there's a fire caused by two trees moving together in a storm. There's a clearing that's burnt. The people come out of the forest into the clearing, and after kind of doing some other stuff, begin to build and create architecture. And so again, if this is the forest with the fire creates this clearing, clears this place. So it creates that kind of red square, and it's in that red square then that architecture, that all of the things that constituted for Vitruvius Roman civilization emerged. And so again, the clearing is the chorus that gave rise to the foundation of Rome and the Roman people. I've talked so far about meditation, cogitation, and contemplation, which Vitruvius might call the three graces. There's a fourth grace that I want to talk about briefly at the end here as I wind things down, and that's the grace or this act of revealing the secrets and revealing the mysteries. In the medieval guild tradition, the knowledge of the guilds, the closely held knowledge of the crafts, were known as the secrets and the mysteries. And they were kind of zealously guarded. It was an arcane or internal language. And Vitruvius writes about this and writes, and so as I describe architecture in its special terms, I'll give an explanation of the meanings of the terms peculiar to the art, so that you can understand the meaning and their kind of use. And again, I come back to the teachings that Dillard and Langer put forward. I come back to the instructions that Sennett and Barth say are important to this. And I want to talk now just a little bit about the idea of teachings in architecture, because in all contemplative practice, it is handed on and taught through kind of instruction and through teaching. And I want to do that by using Louis Kahn as an example. And as I said, he was a great architect, a great teacher. He was born in 1901 in Saaremaa in Estonia and died in 1974 in Penn Station in New York, and was an architect and a teacher. In 1954, he's not particularly remarkable as an architect or a teacher until the 1950s, middle of the 1950s. And in December of 1953, he read this book by Kazuka Okakura, The Book of Tea, which talks about the tea ceremony and introduces a number of ideas that are tied back to the contemplative practices as they relate to Zen. And they had a remarkable effect. I mean, it's the only book he ever cites direct quotations from, and it's the only one he sort of extensively cites quotations from. And right after reading that book, he became a kind of, began to talk in paradoxical terms, because that's what the book describes the masters of contemplation, or the tea masters, are doing, speaking in paradoxes. And he began to write things like this: the beauty of architecture is that it deals in the recessions of the mind from which come all that is said and all that is not yet made. Or, what was has always been, what is has always been, what will be has always been. These fragmentary utterances that at first glance don't seem to make any sense, that are certainly not logical in the way that we would expect them to be as kind of teachings. His writings are fragmentary, and one of the big criticisms of Vitruvius's writings were that they were fragmentary too. They didn't make sense. They were not formed properly within the rules of rhetoric. They were not logical. They jumped all over the place, and there's been a lot of criticism of both Kahn and Vitruvius for the way they kind of wrote. Susan Sontag, in an essay called Notes on Kant, writes this: to name a sensibility, to draw its contours and to recount its history requires a deep sympathy. The sensibility is almost, but not quite, ineffable. To snare a sensibility in words, especially one that is alive and powerful, one must be tentative and nimble. The form of jottings, rather than the essay, with its claim to a linear consecutive argument, seems more appropriate for getting down something of a particular fugitive sensibility. Most architectural writings, most writings by architects, tend to fall into this form of the jotting or the comment, or in the Vitruvian terms, the commentarius, rather than the cogent kind of essay or thesis. And in a sense, Roland Barthes echoes that, writing, the text is a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. The text is a quilt of quotations, a neutral oblique space, where our subject slips away and where identity is lost. He's talking about modern kind of writing, but it's equally well the kind of writing that Vitruvius did. And so to take Sontag and tweak her a little bit, to name a sensibility like architecture, to snare a sensibility in words, especially that one is alive and powerful as architecture, requires the form of jottings. And they're more appropriate to getting down some of architecture's particular fugitive sensibility. And Kahn captures that in some quotes. And I'm just going to read through a series of Kahn quotes as I end things up, because these are the teachings of a great kind of teacher. And he knows that, and he makes this remark: the teacher is a person who not only knows things, but who also feels things, who senses things or knows their sensibilities. the kind of person who can reconstruct the universe by just knowing a blade of grass. I thought of the simplest thing, he writes, and this was the room. The room is a place. It is a sensitive thing. It is a marvelous thing. Its size, its measure, its walls, its light, each has an effect on what you say, what you do. Think of a meaningful space, and you invent a setting, and that is your invention. Therein lies the architect. He then writes, and this is the interior of his Kimball Museum, it is the room that's important when you're in it. The whole building means nothing compared to the room you're in. The designer has duty to give life to a miracle, and that miracle is the realization that the room is the beginning of architecture. If I can go back to the red square, that first space, that Contemplatio, the thing marked by Contemplatio, is in fact the beginning of architecture. He writes strangely about buildings, because to him buildings were animate things. When you make a building, you make a life, and it talks to you. And he goes on later to talk about all sorts of things talking to him, but makes the point that you have to learn how to listen to them. He writes that architecture has existence. It has no presence. It's the work that gives architecture its presence. This is the Salk Institute by Kahn and La Jolla. When you know all the answers about a building before you start building it, your answers are not true. The building always gives you answers as it grows and becomes itself. And that brings me back to that quote I used in the beginning, that this building, the Kimball, and it feels, and it's a good feeling, as if some other hand than my own did it, as if I listened to the building give me the answers as it grew and became itself. Kahn wrote this, and this is almost 4 slides I think I have to go, but wrote this in 1931 about drawing and the way architects should be drawing. The capacity to see, he writes, comes from paying persistent attention or mindful attention to what we are looking at. By practicing this, we will begin to understand the intrinsic character of things and to have respect for the individuality underlying that thing. He wrote this in 1954 to his mistress, Anne Griswold Taine, when she was in Rome having his first illegitimate child. We are trying to put all of the responsibility for discovering what may be the character of today's buildings on someone else. We should arrive at these discoveries through our internal contemplation on the nature of the space. And when he talks about the nature of the space here, he's talking about its intrinsic character, the intrinsic character of that thing. This is a project that's being rendered inside a very sophisticated graphics program. It's the Herva Synagogue, which to be the great synagogue in Jerusalem. And then he writes, now that is why I had great difficulty in explaining the idea of order before. The basis from which order could be derived was absent. It had to satisfy the nature of the space. I now, through contemplation on the nature of the space, have the basis from which an order can be chosen. For Kahn, the intrinsic character of a synagogue was tied to the idea of worship in the Jewish or Hebraic tradition. And as you look at that and you go back into Genesis, what you find is that the first worship that's mentioned took place under a tree. And so Kahn writes that the intrinsic character of the synagogue, the nature of its space, is to worship God under a tree. And so what you see in the synagogue, those 4 kind of overlapping things that you see in the 4 corners, are 4 huge concrete trees that capture that intrinsic nature of the space, that are this kind of contemplative response to what that building wanted to be, to use kind of Kahn's terms. And so we've met 4 graces. We've met the teachings, briefly. We've met Contemplatio and contemplation, the act of kind of marking out that space that becomes special in the world. We've met cogitatio, or reflection, and we've met meditation and meditatio. And those are the Vitruvian echoes in the evolution of contemplative practice in our Western intellectual tradition. And that's where I stop. And thank you for listening for these 45, 42 minutes. And we'll now kind of move and see if I can find questions, if there are any.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter. It was extremely suggestive, and take great pleasure in kind of proceeding to original things, hearing you speak about these generative ideas in architecture. And yeah, the importance of cultivating, persistence of attention and reflectivity, receptivity as being necessary for things to reveal themselves. I found it enormously interesting, and I hope that our listeners did too. Right now we can take written questions. If you have a comment or a question for Peter, this is the time you can type them in. And we have a little bit of time left so that he could address those. Really was a beautiful presentation. Your images are such a pleasure to look at too. Thank you so much. So are there any there that you would like to address?
There are 4 questions up there, and I'll take them in the order that they appear.
Okay.
I'll read the question, then identify the author of the question, and do my best to answer them, and I'll deal with them as best I can. Andrew Levitt asks, what is the role of faith in mindfulness? Well, I could speak to that for a long, long time, but in the context of what I've been talking about, which is really the use of meditatio, cogitatio, and contemplatio in architecture, it sort of doesn't kind of fit. Well, again, the act of contemplation, contemplatio, the sectioning or the creation of hallowed space in Rome and in Greece and in Egypt was in fact an act of extreme piety and extreme faith. And so I'll leave that at that. The next one I'll look at, just let me have a look here. I have a question from Micah Bandini. Is that I hope that's the right pronunciation. I can't hear you. Try and tell me otherwise. Who writes this: Disposito is not disegno and should not be translated as drawing, but as an act of composition. This does not take away from the argument proposed. It adds a veil of complexity. This is interesting. I've written a paper, and it's published in the Journal of Architectural Education, on disegno, and it begins to put these 3 terms together: the act of composition, the act of drawing, and the act of disegno. And in one sense, when you extend the paragraph that I've quoted in very, very brief terms here, you find that Vitruvius moves directly in talking about disposito as the act of drawing, cites the 3 kinds of drawing, and then talks about this reflection and invention in those terms. Nancy Petite asked if I could see the slide with the 3 conditions again. Is the meditatio being referred to more an act of reflection, Western meditation, or more of an act of emptying the mind, Eastern meditation? No, wait, that's wrong. She just asked if she could see that again. It will be difficult for me to do that.
Oh, yeah. Well, the whole webinar, the whole webinar is being recorded, so that will be posted. She can review it, certainly.
You can review that.
Yeah.
Jeff Gannon asks, is meditatio being referred to more as an act of reflection, that's Western meditation, or more an act of emptying of the mind, Eastern meditation? I think that in the terms that I've couched it, the terms that Vitruvius portrays some of these things, and the way that the practice kind of involved, is in fact both of those things. When Kahn talks about sort of, feelings if some hands other than my own did it, of having to sort of wait for the building to give you the answers as it grows and builds itself, that's an emptying posture that one is taking. And in certain times, that one is taking it also as an act of reflection, of an act of active engagement with the work one is doing. Okay. Evan Siegel asks, can you discuss examples integrating meditatio into one's practice? Again, as an architect or as a designer, as a professional, all professionals are schooled in this act of reflection in action. That's what we do. It's what a surgeon does. A surgeon is watching what he or she is doing as he or she is doing what he or she is watching. That's what one has to do because one is kind of, in a sense, engaging the action mindfully because nothing is ever the same. So that, I think losing oneself in drawing, as Khan talks about, I think sort of losing oneself in drawing, as Gary talks about, or as Alto talks about, are all examples of how one can integrate meditatio into one's practice. There are other ways you can do it that come from examples like Lectio Divina, that come from some of the examples of the Zen craft traditions of meditation, active meditation in the Zen tradition that, one could talk about. It says, will the deck be available after the webinar? That I don't know.
The deck of questions, is that what people are interested in? We can, sometimes we have posted the answers to questions that people have had, and, we could create a document and put that with the webinar. It seems helpful, so.
Okay. I have a question from Anthony Palmer. Please elaborate further that all constructions are of the mind. Martin Heidegger makes the point that we build in order to dwell, we dwell in order to think. And so that building and dwelling and thinking are interconnected. The term construction is a term that we apply to building. The term construe is a term that we apply to kind of ideas. And I think in those two terms, the fabrication, fabrica in Latin sort of translates into our fabricate, but also turns into the term fabric, which we use to talk about fabrics of ideas and things like that. So that I think, the idea of construction, the idea of building, the idea of all constructions being of the imagination or of the mind is a really critical thing. Okay, let me see where I are now.
Yeah, we probably have time for a couple of more if you'd like to choose
them. Let me
them.
just see, there's some of them.
Take a moment.
I'll take this one from Brad Grant, because he was one of the fellows as well. Brad writes, Kant speaks of as much of light as the essence of architecture and buildings. How does light influence the contemplative act? Kant talks about light in very metaphysical kind of terms. That light is the maker of structure. He talks about sort of these two realms, the realm of silence, which is where ideas are kind of gestating or where they are becoming, and then the realm of light, which is where they are being, and they cross through a thing that he calls the threshold of the shadow. He invents terms like lightless and darkless to characterize different realms of ideas about kind of architecture. And in a sense, for Khan and I think for many other architects, light is seen as that thing that reveals ultimately, that comes into the chorus or into that kind of space and reveals what architecture talks about or architecture does. I'm reminded of Le Corbusier writing that architecture is the magnificent play of light on forms in space. There are various little differences in translation. But again, making the point that light is that which reveals all of those things that architecture is about. Okay, let me see where I am now. I'm jumping over things here. Neil Baggett asks, do you see architecture as a whole becoming more mindful and mindless at the present day? If I use Ellen Langer's descriptions, You know, I think there are a lot of category errors, there are a lot of single perspective actions, and there are a lot of situations in which we locked into one idea that dominate architectural practice, and so that it is, in a sense, mindless. You know, the reason Ellen Langer writes about mindlessness is not because it's an isolated instance, it's because it's something we do all the time. We kind of act, we sort of cruise by on automatic, if I can put it that way. And so for her, understanding when we're on automatic pilot allows us then to get out of that and to engage in mindful behavior, which she defines in her particular way.
That's helpful. Thank you. Perhaps there's one more that I wondered you wanted to address when we talk about the professional integration, you know, of a reflective practice as really part of the work of being an architect and a surgeon or a poet or whatever the enterprise one is involved in. There's this final question from Jeff Genung about having also a practice of silence, solitude, meditation, or contemplative practice apart from the work that one engages in as a professional or a creative person.
Okay, and that's the one I had highlighted as the one I was going to do next.
Great.
So the question is, do you recommend a regular practice of silence, solitude, meditation, contemplative practice outside the work of creating? It's a question from Jeff Genner. When I started into this with the my Contemplative Practice Fellowship, I had been doing different practices, meditative practices for some years, doing centering prayer. My wife is a Presbyterian minister, doing transcendental meditation when I was a college student, and doing a lot of standing Qigong meditation practice, because that was one that I felt really kind of rooted me back to the earth, and it was one that really helped me a lot. And I kept doing those and still do meditative practices. The interesting thing that I have found since doing the Contemplative Practice Fellowship and developing the 2 courses that I did there, and I've taught those courses almost consistently. The one I've taught consistently twice a year over the last 8 years to usually 200 students a time,
Yeah.
you know, a large freshman class. What I've actually found is that preparing to do the talk, which is integrating ideas about contemplation, has actually become a practice for me. It's become intensely meditative to the point that if people walk into my office on Tuesday mornings when I'm getting ready for class, or they knock on the door and the phone goes, I'll ignore the phone.
Yeah.
And get people out of the room as quickly as possible. But I found that there's that sort of work introducing contemplative practice into my teaching has in fact turned the teaching into something that has become much more reflective, much more of a reflective practice, or much more of a meditation on the subject that I talk about.
Thank you. That was so helpful. And thanks to all of you for attending. Thanks again, Peter, for sharing with us. We're going to have to wrap things up. It's been a very full hour, and many wonderful ideas were shared. So before we sign off, I just want to invite everyone to participate in our next webinar, which will be February 23rd, 2011, also at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And John McCransky, who is professor of Buddhism and comparative theology at Boston College, also a Tibetan Buddhist meditation teacher, will offer, the title is Contemplative Activism, Meditations Adapted from Tibet to Empower Service and Action. And I believe the webinar is designed to address the needs of people working in social science, social change, but I think it will be of interest to all of you who are looking to support efforts toward social justice change born out of contemplative experience. So I hope you'll consider joining us. And registration will be available on the website soon. But for now, farewell until we meet again. Thanks so much.